Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first keynote session, Breakdowns and Breakthroughs of Transactive Knowledge Co-Construction with Dr. Weinberger. My name is Phoebe Jackson. I'm a physics teacher at John Abbott College and a SALTISE fellow. Before we start, just a bit of administration. We've opened the chat to everyone, so you are welcome to chat with each other and make comments in the chat. But if you have a question for Armin, and there will be time for questions after, just click on the Q&A button that you should be seeing. And then everyone can see the questions. If you see a question that pops up in the Q&A that you also want to ask, you can actually upvote it and it will move to the top as they're upvoted. And then I, as the moderator, will get an idea of which questions the audience is really interested in and can ask those at the end. So any questions you hope to get answered should be typed in the Q&A, but you're welcome to do things of a more personal nature in the chat. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Armin Weinberger. Dr. Weinberger is the founding professor and head of the Department of Educational Technology and Knowledge Management at Saarland University. He is one of the most published and cited authors in computer-supported collaborative learning. In fact, just last week, I was at a conference on perusal at Harvard University, and sure enough, Armin's work was heavily cited in the research of several presentations. Dr. Weinberger has 20 years of experience in his field. His main research interests lie in analyzing and facilitating the generation, construction, and sharing of knowledge by groups of people. Today, he will be sharing his insight into the mechanisms of how we think and learn together and how understanding these mechanisms can improve student learning. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Armin Weinberger.
Hello, everyone. The system, the automatic text speech recognition seems to know me, as it translates my name to find burgers, and I am a big fan of burgers. So here we go. Let me just share my screen. I'm going to start with a couple of yes, but provocations that would hopefully provide some food for thought and discussion, as well as underline a need to include scenarios of knowledge co-construction in schools. So here we go. So learners are supposed to become able to participate in practices and discourses of knowing in different fields. And while direct instruction is terribly effective for acquiring domain knowledge, and teachers should actually be taking center stage for these purposes in these scenarios of classroom learning, this may not be as effective for fostering participation in domain discourse. So regular classrooms rarely foresee opportunities to actually practice, to participate in discourse of knowing. Another provocation, the idea of schools is actually to provide education to everyone, but that does not mean that schools are leveling the playing field. In fact, schools also produce, or at least reinforce heterogeneity. The grades tell students who struggle basically that academic success is not part of their identity. And together with a notion of competing with peers, this can and often doesn't lead to shunning academic success. That's for nerds. So that devaluation of academic success is ultimately hurtful to everyone in a class, both those who are academically successful and those who are not. Furthermore, now we look to computer technology promising to help us address these problems, and I think it does help to orchestrate and scaffold different learning arrangements. But so far, let's say, technology does not automatically lead to change, but can perpetuate educational approaches. It often seems to be in the way, quite literally in the way of social interaction. And promises of closing the gap, making education more accessible to disadvantaged groups, have not been realized yet. And of course, computers are sharing here the same fate as other technologies have done before. So there was a big promise of the television to reach out to different groups with educational programs on TV, and that didn't happen either, or wasn't successful. Moreover, we like to think that teachers are keepers of knowledge, assuring that learners would acquire adequate conceptions of a domain, but we tend to overestimate the teacher's role and underestimate the peer's role in learning. Peers scaffold the learning process in ways that often go unnoticed. For instance, this peeking over to the peer to catch up, to compare, etc. Now, of course, you do not want to have that in a test situation that is called cheating, and you would have that right here with Mr. Bean cheating in a test. So that's not what you want, but you can intentionally design for peers helping each other, and you can even scaffold how peers can help each other. So for instance, by instructing students to provide reasons for how something is correct or incorrect. And that is, if you ask me, exactly what has not been done or what has been missing for the most part in this time of crisis of online learning. We have kind of forgotten in our learning designs that were online that learners basically build on this peak over to their peer. So let me give you an example for how you can intentionally design for learning from others. Imagine handing out a difficult individual task to a classroom, and then not to disallow, but to encourage people to share the correct answer once they have found it. So Mercier and colleagues have done this, and what you see is that once one learner has found the correct answer and is able to share it, this answer spreads like wildfire throughout the classroom, especially when peers have an understanding that the one person who has found the right answer is somewhat knowledgeable, especially when the people spreading the answer provide some arguments, some reasons for why it is correct, and when learners are scaffolded to externalize their reasoning, when they're scaffolded to argue. So that is quite tremendous that by providing arguments, you can basically make sure that the correct answer is spreading out, not only as a teacher, but also if peers provide these arguments. Let me give you one final yes, but provocation. Now, if it is participation in practices of domain discourse you want, and there is value in constructing and sharing arguments to foster learning, you may consider to learn with others, that is, learners co-constructing knowledge, discussing complex tasks. Now, one assumption I have for quite some time myself is that learning with others is like an arena for individual cognition. That is, the social surround, your peers basically motivate you, instigate your cognitive processes. And the epistemic quality of discourse mirrors these cognitive processes, making them available, of course, observable and analyzable. So you can actually observe how thought is formed and potentially altered through discussion. That is actually also still true, but in the past years, I have accumulated a body of research in different domains, age groups, cultures, that shows that there is another quality. And I hope I can interest you in what that quality is. It's transactivity, which is defined as operating on others' reasoning, and that has to be found to be the best predictor for co-construction of knowledge. Of course, we're talking about co-construction of knowledge in complex tasks that provide some space of debate, where there is some understanding that multiple perspectives can be applied, where there is some uncertainty about which knowledge to apply to the respective task. So transactivity has actually some evolutionary basis, and evolutionary arguments are currently en vogue in psychology, and so transactivity has that as well. It builds on ideas that what sets us apart from animals is that we can interpret the intentions of one another and help each other even when there is no immediate reward. And that we as a human species have done so, at least within our respective tribes, also on a cognitive level. That is, we are not to understand something individually, but with peers who scrutinize one's own developing understanding. So among the findings that leading to that assumption are that what has been found is that we're not so good in criticizing our own ideas, but we excel. We're really good at criticizing the ideas of others. And that is not a bug, or as it has been regarded as a kind of a bias of humans, but really a feature of thinking together. So this yes, but way of responding that you may experience, I think you have, it's a great idea, but. So this yes, but way of responding to people is basically our default mode of responding to others' ideas. And that's something to build on. So whenever we are in a transactive dialogue, we are actually making use of an evolutionary advantage, or vice versa. If we are not talking transactively, we are giving up on that evolutionary advantage. And this advantage seems to take effect in scenarios of learning together, of knowledge co-construction too. So transactive talk has been found to facilitate individual learning, domain knowledge, on an individual level as well as on a group level. So transactive talk has been also found to foster knowledge convergence, reducing heterogeneity among students of a class. And that's an interesting goal in itself. And has been found to foster collaboration skill and metacognitive regulation of learning. So now, while transactivity is connected to a fundamental idea of how we are thinking together, it also seems to be a bit vulnerable, at least in learning contexts. I'm afraid also in larger contexts of how our society works, but certainly also in learning context. One thing is that we are talking here about complex tasks for which learners need to be able to bring some ideas and knowledge to the table. So there is like a lower knowledge limit. If there is zero prior knowledge, you couldn't really engage in debate. There also seems to be an upper limit or upper knowledge limit. So if you believe that you know everything about a domain, you also kind of do not have a space of debate. And that has been found that when people believe they already know all there is to know about a problem, and typically that's just the belief. It's not the actual knowledge, because there's always more to know. But there is a belief, okay, I've got it. I have my opinion sorted out, and I think I've learned enough about it. They then consolidate their knowledge prematurely, I'd say, and are somewhat overconfident, that they can solve the task alone and are less willing then to engage in transactive talk. Moreover, there are some motivational misalignments that frequently emerge in groups of learners. I don't want to let those go unnoticed. Let me briefly show you the major ones, which have been once called by some colleagues, "you will do it anyway" phenomenon. So a case of social loafing or free riding. And that, of course, makes sense. Yeah? Students may be overly economical with respect to complex tasks. That is, they will not engage much, but try to free ride, orientating themselves towards the minimal requirements of a complex task. And that would maybe lead peers to take over the task at first, but then also lose motivation in the long run. And that is the sucker effect. And that taken together is, of course, connected somehow. Yeah? So people align basically the motivation with the motivation of their peers. And that can then be problematic if that is on a low level. And of course, taking that together can lead to a Matthew effect. Matthew meaning the rich are getting richer, the poor poorer, those who engage in the task more learn more, those who don't do not. So since transactivity seems to be vulnerable for multiple reasons, there seems to be a need for scaffolding transactivity for knowledge co-construction. And among the ways to scaffold transactivity, there are two that I want to highlight, and that is to provide feedback on processes of knowledge co-construction through awareness tools in that case. And the other way is to give a feed forward, that is to provide a structure of interaction up ahead through collaboration scripts that distribute roles and activities in collaborative learning scenarios. The one thing aims to facilitate internal regulation more. One aims to inform learners about what is going on in the group and respond to that accordingly without really defining how to respond to that. The other is more directive and provides an external regulation, an external structure upfront, and also, tells learners what to expect. Let me give you some examples for that. So Visual Group has collected and visualized learners' opinions and knowledge, so learners would know whom they are talking to, what they would know. ArgueGraph, very similar, visualized opinions of students within a class, and so basically they were handed out a survey, just as with Visual Group, and filling that out, leading to be represented by one of these dots. I don't know how well you can see that, but each of those dots in that graph is one person and his or her opinion with respect to a certain matter on 2 dimensions. So you can see where you are at, whether you are more in the mainstream, let's say, or whether you're taking a more extreme position in the classroom. And of course, the idea of this awareness tool, without actually, defining that or directing people to it, would be to say, hey, maybe you want to check out opinions that are different from yours. And we have been crazy enough to implement that into Facebook as a Facebook app, just to see if that works and see whether that scales. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a minute. So examples for scripts are the Toulmin script, according to a scientist and a model of argumentation that aims to facilitate the quality of the discourse contributions. So for instance, to help learners construct sound arguments, that is to add evidence and qualifications to the claims or to construct counter arguments and so on. And the peer review script, one of the most successful scaffolds or scripts for transactivity, you can basically realize a peer review script either by grouping learners heterogeneously, so you again have to assess in advance the diverging standpoints, or you provide learners with complementary resources. So you give one learner theory A or the other theory B. You can also assign specific roles and activities to them. That's what we mostly did. So we said, okay, you're the analyst here and you're the critic. And later on, you can rotate those roles. The main thing is that you're creating some kind of divergence within such a small group and let them have a go at each other, utilizing this divergence. Yeah? That there's some, again, space for debate and certain roles to criticize each other. Right. So let me give you an impression of how these scaffolds for transactive knowledge co-construction played out in a couple of scenarios and studies. I'm going to be very quick about them, not go too much into details or talk about numbers, but still, let me take a look on one long-term field study on co-constructing knowledge in Facebook using this argue-graph awareness tool that I just showed you, an in vitro study on collaborative drawing with tablets of STEM phenomena, and another in vitro study on scaffolding knowledge co-construction on proportions against STEM, that's mathematics, using iPads as mini tabletops. In vitro study means that you're basically not doing that in the lab, but you're going out to the schools and trying to be as real and authentic as possible, basically conducting your studies in the classroom. However, having a kind of control setting so that you would be able to also arrive at some generalizable data. So, right, so let's take a look at the first study, long-term field study. That means that we have not done a one-shot going in and going out again, but accompanied the group over a couple of weeks. And having checked for these regular sessions, one group awareness tool that made learners aware, as I showed you before, of their opinion in relation to the opinion of peers. And basically, of course, that in itself, hoping to foster transactive dialogue, saying, okay, check out your opinion in relation to others and connect to these others. And then we were more directive and combined this feedback with this feed forward kind of scaffold to say, hey, actually do make use of this awareness tool, follow up on the arguments of your peers, evaluate them, rank them, to be a bit more directive, but very much aligned in this case with the awareness tool, or with the general, the initial idea of the awareness tools right here. Good. So yeah, so that's how it looked like. We implemented in Facebook. Again, I said this is a bit crazy because Facebook is, of course, not a learning environment, but we were having ideas of, hey, we could actually venture into more informal scenarios of learning, and maybe Facebook could be a mediator for that. Right, so this is the result. Again, forget about the numbers. I'm not going to talk much about them, but what you see here are these different conditions: the group awareness tool, the argumentation script, the combination, and the control group. And you see here these different weeks. And what is so interesting about this is, I think that especially the script does seem to help develop a certain culture of discourse across time. So it's not only like a one-shot thing, but people are appropriating standards of discourse over time. They are continuously understanding what is expected from them. And that is not independent of the scaffolds that you provide, but is very much connected to the scaffolds that you do provide. And the combination condition works best, obviously, but the script itself is kind of very effective as well. Whereas the control group kind of stays on the same level. So what you're doing as a teacher, if you don't have those tools at hand, is pretty important here. You basically, and that kind of is the result, or is the hope that this result is giving me at least, you can establish and develop a culture of discourse within the classroom. Right, and these are the individual learning outcomes in this case, and you can see that those tools also make a difference. You have a strong significant effect of the script and a medium-sized significant effect of the group awareness tools on the individual learning outcomes. So this matters also in terms of learning. Let me just jump right on to another study on collaborative drawing, a study I have conducted in the Netherlands. We developed an intelligent drawing software that can recognize what students are drawing and can adaptively support them and make learners aware that parts are missing, nudging them to complete and improve their drawings. For instance, naming the phenomena that they are drawing. Now, the drawings are not about aesthetics. Don't look at them. Yeah, that's not fair. It's about representing a certain scientific phenomenon adequately. And yeah, so the software, on top of this kind of awareness feature of saying, hey, you're missing out on explaining or drawing an error or drawing the sun, which is part of both the water cycle and photosynthesis, and you're missing out, or you should be also naming these things, give them names. The software also orchestrated different learning arrangements. So first, students were to draw science phenomena like the water cycle individually, and then they turned the tablet around and saw their own and a drawing of their peer to compare and discuss differences with. And ultimately then in the next step, build a third best of joint drawing of the science phenomenon together. And the results show that interestingly, the script, again, of combining peer drawings to a best of drawing contributed to more to the quality of the drawing than the drawing software, this smart awareness feature software that made learners aware of what parts are missing. The script contributed more to that, to the quality of the drawing, quality in terms of how well it represented the phenomenon and included the respective concepts that are to be learned to apply here, better than this awareness feature. And both types of scaffolds also facilitated domain learning. So that doesn't look like much here, but that is maybe a question of how to fairly show the outcomes, and these differences are actually significant. So it does matter if you scaffold or using this kind of scaffolds, also with respect to not only the processes, but also the outcomes. Here's another study, final one. Learners using iPads as mini tabletops for 2 students to improve understanding of proportions, which is kind of important because that's kind of a crucial moment in the learning of mathematics, to understand that you kind of need to go beyond your fingers to understand here. And the iPad app we developed had a pedagogical agent, the owl, because that's kind of the symbol of our university. And that owl listens to students and provides feedback and provides suggestions to explain how the task can be approached. And we compared that with the script feature, which was prompts to apply specific strategies and to verbalize their strategies and their ways of thinking about the problem. And the results are, in terms of the quality of dialogue, that especially this verbalization, the script that facilitated learners' transactive talk, asking them to verbalize how they go about the task, was actually facilitating the transactive quality as well as the epistemic quality of talk. Epistemic quality meaning the extent to which they can actually adequately apply the concepts to the problem at hand. Right, yeah, so that's basically it. Let me just give you quickly an overview on what I conclude from that. That there are breakdowns and yeah, both on the cognitive sides as well as on a motivational side of transactive talk that have to do with how much you align, terms of how much you align within a group motivationally, but also how much you think you know about something and how much you actually know about the problem at hand. And the one central thing, I think, or conclusion would be that it does work. Yeah, you can learn quite effectively together with a peer and co-construct knowledge, but you cannot ask people to learn together and then leave the room and saying, "Oh, now I have time on my own. That's great. This is excellent," and you sort it out. But you actually have to provide some type of scaffolding. So this really makes or breaks learning together. It's definitely worthwhile to scaffold it. If you don't, it actually falls behind, for instance, to individual learning scenarios. And effective scaffolding for transactive knowledge co-construction would have some features like helping learners to orientate within a learning environment, which is kind of important. If you're having a complex task, if you don't know, oh, I'm collaborating now, what does that actually mean? And that's a very, very straightforward feature that basically providing some structure is actually helping reduce process losses. One other notion is that if you provide a heads up, if you feed forward a structure, it also informs people that they have to expect some response from a peer, maybe some critical response, which kind of changes the gameplay quite a bit and changes the engagements that learners would have. So the expectation of working together and having to justify what you are saying to a peer is very helpful in this setting. And of course, this notion of comparing, elaborating, reasoning about different peer perspectives, and ultimately a glimpse of hope that you can or you do establish a culture of relating to one another, a culture of dialogue within the classroom and among students. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Armin. That was really, really great. Very interesting. I was very excited about your presentation, and I think it exceeded my expectations. So we do have numerous questions in the question box. I might just start with a few clarifying questions to start us off. So a few people have been asking, actually, let's start with this one. Are you able to give us an example of a talk that is transactive and a talk that is not transactive?
Yes, that's a very good question. So, for instance, one of the most transactive discourse moves would be to be constructively critical about what someone else has said, because you have to relate to what the other person is saying. You cannot criticize something without relating to it. Actually, that is a kind of relating to someone else. You would, if you criticize something constructively, you would also have to provide an alternative. And that is exactly the second notion of transactivity, that you operate on the reasoning of someone. So it has basically these two notions of novelty, as well as, of course, reference. And an example of non-transactive talk. So when I'm calling my mother and I'm asking her, so how are you doing? And she tells me, I'm having fish tonight. You know, you're just, it's a disconnect. And of course I'm selling my mother here, but she's hard in hearing, and so she has a reason for not talking transactively. But you certainly have an understanding or have a notion of when you connect And when you have a productive kind of discussion, when you really scrutinize and build on what your peer is saying, different from juxtaposing one idea after the other.
Thank you. That's great. Another clarification question is, you did give a example on one of your slides, but could you clarify even more when you refer to a script as to what you're talking about, what a script looks like, and maybe even, if possible, outside of CSCL, like when we're actually in the classroom in person, because assuming that is coming up soon, what a script would look like.
Right. So the original idea of scripts actually has been something that has been taught in the classroom without computer representation. We're just having taken it to the realm of computer-supported collaborative learning because it's so practical to represent it by having prompts included in the text boxes and on the screen. In text-based communication, that's particularly easy because there you do not need to train learners so much. But if you're in the classroom, that actually means, or that's how it has been realized in the past, that you're taking a little bit of time to train learners in a certain interaction pattern. So it does make sense to, for instance, train learners in what it means to criticize something constructively. Because otherwise you would maybe indeed run into issues of microaggressions, for instance. So that is somehow the way it has been done in the past. So for instance, there has been let's say trainings in how to criticize, or trainings in how to iterate through a task and rotate the roles. And then you basically execute this kind of structure. For instance, in a peer reviewing setting or in a peer teaching kind of setting, then you're being taught, what does it mean to teach something? What criteria would you have to apply to explain something properly? And now we execute it, and now the next one is taking over that role, and so on.
Thank you. So maybe to build on that, and I'll come back to some of the other questions here in the Q&A box, but it's directly related to scripts. So implementing something like this, I mean, a lot of us have probably tried things like assigning roles and helping students play specific roles in their group work, which does sound like a form of the script that you're talking about, especially if the role is elaborated on for them. But I know I personally often find that it adds an extra layer of, it's like cognitive overload for the students. They're having to do the task I'm setting them, and they're having to play this role. And often it feels like it's too much, and then I pull back. So how can we script our students without overloading them on what is already going to be a complex task?
Right. That has been discussed, and there was this notion of over-scripting, this idea of you're providing too much regulation and you leave too little room for exploration, for your own thought, for your applying your own strategies. And it also has been discussed not only on a cognitive overload kind of perspective, but also on a motivational level, that this overscripting would also hamper motivation. We haven't found any effects on motivation, but of course the cognitive overload that you're mentioning is something of concern. So that is twofold basically. One thing is that the more interesting scripts actually are designed so that they do problematize something. So anyone can communicate about a task and in their own fashion. So you don't necessarily need to teach them how to communicate. Now, if you're asking them to construct arguments, that's a whole different ballgame, because that actually makes the task harder. And Brian Reiser wrote an excellent article some years back that this is what scaffolds sometimes have to do to make a task harder. But of course, there is a notion of, hey, is there an overload at some point? And would people get frustrated. So you have to tackle that somehow. One part of it is, of course, to space it and to provide breaks. And we found also that learners actually have to manage, especially young learners, the ones I showed you. Young learners, basically, it's also a question of management of load and of stress also, and of work. And it's interesting then to see that a script can rotate the role, so, and of course can also rotate the load you would be giving them. And productive teams then sometimes manage or are productive because they do that quite effectively, that one takes over and complements the other, whereas the other one can then rest again and recharge to some extent. And you may want to include that in your script as well, and also, you know, make it bite-sized. But of course, it is a bit challenging that that the goals you want to reach to have a productive, accountable academic discourse, it does take a little bit. Yeah? And well, I think it's also worth it to introduce that, maybe not only by training them, but also by modeling that, yeah, to show how that is being done as well. That's a very good way to teach in the classroom, actually.
Thank you. So there was a few questions about epistemic quality of discussion. So people are curious about how you quantify that and what you mean by that.
Right, the epistemic quality is really, we are mostly interested in how learners do not so much how much they memorize concepts, we're looking at that as well, yeah, and are able to externalize the knowledge after such a learning experience, but really to what extent they have understood something and are able to apply concepts to problem case information, whether they identify the relevant concepts and whether they can create adequate, correct relations between specific task characteristics and case information and the respective concepts. And this is something that emerges in discourse. So when I'm saying, oh, the case of Michael is a case of a stable internal attribution of success, then I'm using these, in this example, psychological concepts and applying it to something that Michael has shown, this case information. Yeah, and this is something I utter and that I can see in the discourse. So large part of what we're doing is to actually analyze those discourses for concept case relations. That's not always the case. You also, sometimes people repeat the concepts, or sometimes people talk only about the case, and that is also something we're looking at. But that's how you can break down basically how they solve the task while talking. Yeah.
Great. And so there's an interesting question here that Corey Legasic posted, and people are very interested in it. Do you have any examples of research or anything to say on how the impacts of emotions, particularly stress, anxiety, anger, and guilt, affect transactivity?
That is such an interesting question, because we have started that and we're setting out to do some more about it. And I said just now that we're analyzing discourse, but we're also starting to analyze the facial expressions, the gestures, and to analyze exactly the emotional dimension of transactive talk. And I mean, we have seen that there is kind of like, as I said before, a kind of like management of emotions, also of stress in that sense, where people can productively help each other if the group is set up so. And that can also sometimes be that complementary groups, yeah, one being calm and the other one is more excited, can complement each other in ways that are very productive. Very often it is, however, also very good that they align to the same kind of level of engagement. And so that is something we're doing now, and we're looking at now, and follow up on assumptions that we influence each other with respect to our emotions. And what is known about these emotions is, of course, that there are some emotions that are conducive to learning and some that are kind of in the way of learning. But that is really something we're still exploring to some extent. But I do think there is an emotional dimension to transactivity. I think transactivity actually goes way deeper than just cognitive processes of learning, but it goes deeper in the sense of respecting each other, being aware of each other, and acknowledging each other. So it runs way deeper, and is certainly worthwhile also to take this angle and foster that angle as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. So actually, this relates to a question someone asked, and you did start to get into it in your presentation about, does transactivity increase as students become more experienced with the discourse of their discipline? For example, I can imagine it's really important to scaffold collaboration of, I'll stay within our age range here, but of say first-year college students. But how would that scaffolding change if my students are graduate students?
So most of my research actually is about university students, which we regard as adults, and the things that I showed you are some exceptions almost with primary school students. We haven't really, and that was really curious, we haven't really found so extremely much difference in these different age groups. Actually, everyone is kind of sensitive to these interaction patterns and can work with these feed forward collaboration scripts and this feedback. What we did find, however, were some cultural differences, because a script is not only something that is provided from an external stance or an external regulation. You could also regard a script as an internal structure. So you have some idea of how to collaborate. And there is a difference, for instance, between what we did, a Finnish sample and a German sample. And the Germans are rather straightforward. So they like to criticize, or basically criticizing is in their nature to some extent. And the Finnish are much more reserved in this regard. And we applied a peer review script asking people to be critical with each other. And basically the Finnish group arrived at the levels of criticism with the script that the Germans had without the script. And the Germans were like taking off, being super critical with the script, almost scary. So so there is certainly this kind of or very interesting influence, but we haven't really found much of an age group difference. But of course, we also haven't investigated that systematically. So you would adjust, of course, your structures to the respective age group.
Great, thank you. So we spoke about the effect of overloading our students by assigning them scripts, and you addressed that really well. I think some of us are probably also interested in not overloading the teacher. And a lot of us, myself, we feel that we can tell when a group is working productively just intuitively. It's like our teacher's spidey sense. So why is it important for us to look at this level of theoretical mechanisms of group work and productive discussion? Are we not as capable just by listening and acting in the moment?
Of course, in the end, this research needs to be somehow in the back of our minds, and the proof is in the pudding, in being in the classroom and then scaffolding accordingly. Also, by the way, it's not only the teachers know if a group is working or not, but also the students understand when it's working or not. Yeah, you can drive a car without knowing how the engine works, but you can have better hypotheses of how to scaffold when you have some idea about the car noises. So you basically, first of all, you might gain a picture of what kind of dialogue you want to implement or want to cultivate in a classroom. I think that is something to strive for. And then having this kind of understanding that there are different qualities, and it's not just the content quality or the epistemic quality, but it's really how people work with each other and relate to each other, that is beneficial for multiple learning outcomes. That kind of helps you to know where you're going or where you want to go. And of course, it also would help you to analyze what exactly the problem is, whether people are actually aligning or are relating to one another, or one is looking in the other direction and one person is doing everything. I mean, then of course, as a teacher, you would say there is something wrong, but knowing and describing what is wrong, and then also knowing what kind of scaffolds would lead learners to actually interact with each other, that is probably the more important thing to take away from this kind of research and using these different types of scaffolds. Although there are, of course, kind of like now in particular technology enhanced kind of settings, but I'm hoping that you could break it down and also take it out of such a computer environment and apply it in the classroom, at least the principles of them.
Great. There was a question that I think has been dismissed. I'm not sure, perhaps the author dismissed it, but it's also related to something that has come up before. Is it possible that a transactive discussion can actually cause harm? Like, can it go wrong in the classroom? There was some discussion about microaggressions and is transactivity always in a positive direction? It also not just harm, psychological harm, but perhaps conceptual harm. Can students build on each other's reasoning in the wrong direction?
Yeah, that is the interesting notion of two wrongs making a right. How would that be possible? And it does seem to be possible if they are scaffolded to argue with each other in a transactive fashion. So that would indeed be a core claim here. Again, well, of course, within a certain range of prior knowledge. So of course, we're not talking here about learners having zero knowledge about something, and the only thing I need to do is to make sure that they're relating to one another. That's not what I'm talking about. There needed to be some kind of understanding, but also some uncertainty, some space of debate, basically. And you need to bring knowledge to the table. It's more about applying knowledge than learning from scratch. That I would underline here. But I also think that this kind of settings in which you cater for conceptual change rather than factual knowledge are not unrelated to how learners acquire knowledge in a larger scale. So in terms of when there is an understanding of how knowledge is a tool that can be applied rather than something fixed and something that is unchangeable, people would be better able to work it, to use it in different contexts and reapply it, and also understand further knowledge in schools as something that is useful to them. That would be the larger goal here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I see, you spoke at the beginning about how we're trying to get our students to engage in our discourse of whatever discipline we're teaching them, and whether they're engaging in the right way or the wrong way in terms conceptually, they're still engaging. So are there ways, this might relate to Carolyn's question here. Oh, and I just see a new question pop up. I'll get to it in a minute. So Carolyn had asked how scaffolding differs online and in person. And you did actually speak about that a bit earlier with another question. But also, are there ways to scaffold online or in person that aren't scripts? Are there other things we can also do or should be doing?
Yeah, definitely. I was talking a little bit about modeling. I mean, if you really want to, I mean, basically the classroom of the future will be to some extent, I guess, also technology supported and hybrid in a way. So I wouldn't, let's say, discard this and do my best to avoid any kind of technological tool. These are very, you know, adequate ways of creating such a culture of dialogue. But if you want to, you know, dial it back to the, you know, regular classroom and you're acting in it as a teacher, then indeed, as I said, it is a bit about modeling it yourself. So that would, if you translate it into teacher talk, you would be saying, okay, I'm using these techniques of relating to someone and then working with it, operating on it, using that in the classroom as well. And then maybe explicating these strategies as heuristics that learners should be applying as well, and make a little game of that to basically, yeah, teach each other and peer review each other in a discourse, in a classroom conversation.
We have a question from Dr. Reiger at UBC. What are your favorite strategies for creating buy-in? So how do you get this, in particular, he asked this, how do you get the students who know everything, or the opposite, the social loafers, on board with what you're doing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and a hard one. What are the tricks here? And now, um, I really have to think a little bit about that, because of course we all know what that means in practice. Yeah, also in the seminar room in university, there are of course social loafers and cause for quite some frustration, because what you're doing, at least on a university level, is basically providing an offer to learn about something, and you cannot force feed them to engage in one form or another. But we do set criteria for that kind of participation. So you do specify that this kind of yeah, contributions to discourse are part of the requirements. I mean, once you're there, of course, you kind of have already formalized it in a way that um, uh, that then necessitates this kind of action. But the first study that I showed you was actually a university setting, and there you could see that learners continuously understood better what the requirements were. So you could set up and specify a rubric of what the qualities are that you want from them in their contributions, and could, of course, by peer feedback, by peer review, point out to what extent that is actually happening in the process and in the classroom discussion. So of course, I'm now the thing that makes me think is, to what extent does that translate to the school classroom? Yeah, to I don't know, now elementary school, there would be a large like step, yeah, and to what extent students would appropriate that, because that is kind of like the trick and the next step to think ahead of. It's not just providing these scaffolds and to script them, but the bigger kind of step would be for learners to realize the meaning of these scripts, so to speak, and realize them as something to internalize, something that is worthwhile also to internalize. That would be awesome, of course. And you can do that to some extent by specifying that, making that part of the requirements, of course, and having people check each other for these criteria.
Thank you. That was a hard question. That your answer actually makes a lot of sense. So thank you. I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for your presentation today. It's been very, very informative. I've learned a lot. I think everyone here would feel the same. There are more questions keep coming in, but we are out of time. So once again, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Thank you for your interest. It was a pleasure.
That was wonderful.
Thank you, Liz.
I see we're still being recorded.
You can wave.